I just want to do God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. Randy Robinson here, and I'm excited about today's program. You know, a gentleman that I've had the privilege to interview several times over the years is Lee Strobel, and of course, The Case for Christ was huge. They made a really good movie out of it, and then recently, The Case for Heaven came out, and this one's interesting. It doesn't quite lend itself in the way that The Case for Christ did to a dramatic film, but it lends itself very well to a documentary, which is out now, and you can see it. We'll tell you how. But first, I want to show you this little trailer, and then we will be back with Lee Strobel to talk about The Case for Heaven. Watch this.
It was the most ambitious investigation of my life.
I was there when you looked up into the night.
Can near-death experiences tell us anything reliable about life after death? And why should we trust what Jesus tells us about heaven and about hell?
If we could just touch heaven for 1 second in this film, I think that might be enough.
Jesús dice, yo soy el camino, la verdad y la vida.
They are trying to find some way to live on beyond their death. They're running out of time.
The whole point of the resurrection is that I wouldn't have to fear it in a sense of, oh no, what's going to happen next?
I didn't really care whether I was going to heaven or hell.
I have absolutely no idea what happens after we die.
There's something that it is to be us. There's something that it is like to be you.
When we die, we leave our natural bodies, but we're still ourselves. It's life on steroids. It's life beyond anything we've experienced.
When we close our eyes in this world, that isn't the end of our existence.
I mean, the best is yet to come.
That is The Case for Heaven, an inspiring documentary and fascinating, really. And Lee Strobel is with me now. Lee, great to have you back on Live Today. I appreciate you being here with me on Zoom.
Well, I'm glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I think, just knowing you, that you were probably a little like me when you walked into this topic, which is a little skeptical because we hear a lot of strange things, and I don't believe them all, you know?
Yeah.
What did you find when you started investigating this?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of stumbled into this in the sense that I almost died several years ago. My wife found me unconscious. I woke up in the emergency room. The doctor said to me, you're 1 step away from a coma, 2 steps away from dying. And then I went unconscious again. So I lingered between life and death for quite a while until the doctors were able to save my life. And that really was a clarifying experience because when you're in that situation, nothing is more important than what happens when you close your eyes for the last time in this world. And that's what prompted me to investigate this topic. Of course, as a believer, I believe what the Bible teaches. I believe I go to heaven, but I've also got that skeptical bent, you know, from my days as an atheist, my journalism training, my legal training. And so I needed to know, how can I know for sure that heaven is real and that I'm going to spend eternity there? And that's what resulted in the book, The Case for Heaven, and now the documentary, The Case for Heaven.
Yeah, I know the Bible does talk about heaven. I believe in heaven, but I think sometimes it's a little bit like trying to explain quantum physics to a third grader. To us, I think this is
that is a very astute observation, because when the Bible says no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has even conceived of what God has in store for those who love him. And you're right. I mean, think of this. When the Bible's trying to tell us about heaven, you know, in this world, we see a certain color spectrum, and it's based on the light of the sun. In heaven, the color spectrum is going to be based on the light of God. We're going to see colors in heaven that we've never experienced in this world. Well, the problem with that is, how do you describe a color to someone who's never seen it? You can't.
Yeah.
And so the Bible uses a lot of figurative language, a lot of metaphors to try to hint at us to the reality of heaven and what it might be like. But that is a conundrum. It's like you said, trying to explain quantum physics to a third grader.
Yeah. So what about these near-death experiences? Because I think a lot of times it's our maybe the chemicals in our brains, our imagination, kind of like a dream. How do we know if those are just our own machinations, to use a big word, or if they're something more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was a skeptic about this. I thought this was just some brain chemistry issue. But then I found there are 900 scholarly articles written about near-death experiences in scientific and medical publications over the last 50 years. This is a very well-researched area. The Lancet, which is the famous medical journal in England, published an article analyzing all these alternative explanations, like it's brain chemistry or oxygen deprivation or whatever. None of them, the article concludes, are able to explain this phenomenon. And so what I looked at were those cases where we had corroboration, because I'm a skeptic. I need corroboration. So for instance, in the case of Maria, she died in the hospital of a heart attack. So she's flatlined, she's clinically dead. But she said later, I was conscious the whole time. She said, my spirit separated from my body. I was kind of floating near the ceiling. I was watching the resuscitation efforts on my body. And then my body floated up and through and out of the hospital. And when she was revived, she said, oh, by the way, on the roof of the hospital, there's a man's tennis shoe and it's left-footed. It's dark blue. There's some wear over the little toe and the shoelace is tucked under the heel. So they go up on the roof and they find it exactly as she described it. So that's the kind of corroboration I'm looking for, is something that says if people saw things or heard things during a near-death experience that they could not have otherwise seen or heard, that gives credibility to the fact that the Bible's telling us the truth when it says that our spirit or our soul separates from our physical body at the time of death. Yeah. And by the way, that example I gave is just one of, there was another research project with almost 100 cases of those kind of verifiable observations made during near-death experiences, and 98% of them were accurate. So, and we have another study done of 21 blind people, half of them blind since birth. And during their near-death experience, they were able to see, many of them for the first time in their life. They saw people trying to resuscitate their bodies and so forth. They saw plants, they saw animals. And then when they were revived, they lost their eyesight again. That's wild. As one researcher said, this is medically impossible. So I think we have good evidence that when Paul says that to be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord, when Jesus said to the repentant criminal on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise, indeed, this is confirmation that at our time of clinical death, our spirit or soul does separate from our physical body and stays alive.
What do the secular people that you talk, because I know you talk to a wide range of people.
Yeah.
What do they do with this? Because this defies science, or not defies it. It's beyond science. It's supernatural, above the natural. How do they respond?
Yeah, I think a lot of the skepticism or criticism that comes from people who are skeptics is based on the kind of things I used to think. Oh, certainly this can be explained away as brain chemistry or something like that, until they see the cases of the corroboration. And then they just kind of throw up their arms and say, well, I don't know what to do with that. It doesn't fit their worldview. What's fascinating to me, though, is that in the book and in the movie, I interviewed John Burke, who is a Christian pastor. He's a pastor of a church in Austin, Texas. He is studied 1,000 near-death experiences over 10 years. And his conclusion is when you look at what actually takes place during a near-death experience, not how people interpret it, but what actually takes place, it's consistent with Christian theology.
Okay, I'll push back a little bit, not because I disagree with you, but I know based on our past interviews that I always get the comments about, Buddhists having sort of these Buddhist near-death experiences, or other religions having a near-death experience that tracks with their religion.
Yeah, here's the problem with that. They studied 500 near-death experiences in India, 500 in the United States, and compared them. They were the same. They're basically the same. People in India, for instance, a Hindu does not experience the god of Shiva during a near-death experience. They have the same kind of experience that everybody has. Now, here's the difference. It's how we interpret it. Yeah. So in other words, it's common in a near-death experience to encounter a being of light. We understand that to be God.
Yeah.
Now, a Hindu may have a near-death experience where this being of light is holding a book. And they may interpret that as saying, oh, that's consistent with Hinduism. That's the book of karma.
Okay.
But that's an interpretation, whereas God does have a book in Christian theology. It's a book of life. Mm-hmm. And so it's consistent with Christian theology. So I think we have to look at what actually takes place as opposed to how people view it through their worldview. But people are much more apt to see Jesus than anybody else.
I mean, I believe it. I just know that people have a hard time in a lot of ways. What about the ones that are maybe just dreams or brain chemistry? Because surely that happens too.
It does. And, we also have false reports. Several years ago, there was a young man who claimed that he died and went to heaven and met Jesus. And there was a motion picture made of it, and there was a book written about it, and he later confessed he made the whole thing up.
I interviewed him.
I mean, he was very convincing. That's why I really focus on the cases with corroboration. Cases published in medical journals. I looked at the case of the woman from Atlanta, Georgia, who had a brain aneurysm, bleeding in her brain. They lowered her body temperature in a special surgery to 60 degrees. She had 3 tests showed she had zero brain waves. She had no heartbeat. She's clinically dead. Her eyes are taped shut. She has earplugs in her ears that have 100 decibels of sound going in, which is the sound of a freight train next to her. And she has this incredible surgery. Well, she says, I was conscious the whole time, despite the fact having zero brain waves. And she was able to, here's a corroboration, she was able to describe the exact unusual surgical instruments that were used during her surgery, even though they had been covered up prior to her surgery. She was able to recount some of the conversations that took place during her surgery in the surgical suite. Things that she could not have known if indeed she had zero brain waves at the time. So these are the kind of corroborated cases that I'm looking at. And to me, these are convincing that indeed our consciousness or our spirit does continue to exist.
Surely, I would think the doctors and the nurses in that room, when they found that out, because they're going to know, they know exactly. You don't have to prove anything to them. I would think they would fall to their knees. Do you see any conversions around these things?
I know. I mean, there's a story of the woman, not just a story, but a medical report of the woman in England who died after an abortion, bled to death. And she later was revived out of her death state. And she said, by the way, the ceiling fan in the emergency room has a red sticker on the top of the blade that she was able to see from her perspective after her soul had separated from her body. And they got a ladder in the emergency room and they looked, and sure enough, on the invisible to the people in the room, but from the top, they were able to see this red sticker. These kind of things just blow my mind. There was a woman who not only was she dead, she was declared dead. She was being wheeled off to the morgue. She is suddenly revived, and she says she's able to recount the designs on the ties of the people in the emergency room when she was deceased, what their ties looked like. She recalled a joke that was told by one of the doctors to try to relieve the tension in the room. So these are really convincing cases.
You keep talking about the people going up. Does everyone go up? Do they all see heaven, or do you think people see the alternate?
Yeah, 23% of people have hellish experiences in their near-death experience. And I think the real number is probably a lot higher, but most people are too embarrassed to say, oh, yeah, I died and I went to hell because I'm frankly an awful person. So we have in our movie interviewed Howard Storm as an example. Howard was an atheist. He was an art professor at a secular university. and he died in the hospital. But he said, I was conscious the whole time. And he describes how he had this hellish experience, how these demons literally reduced him to roadkill. He said, no horror film can even come close to describing the horror of what I went through. When he was finally revived, by the way, he called out to Jesus in the middle of this, and Jesus rescued him from this. And when he was revived, he not only resigned his tenured position at the university, he not only renounced his atheism, he not only became a Christian, he became a ordained minister and is now pastor of a tiny little church in rural America. And we interview him in the movie. He has PTSD. I mean, this was such a traumatic experience. And so, I think the good news is heaven is real. The bad news is hell is real.
Yeah. Okay. This is the film, The Case for Heaven, the documentary, which is available now on PureFlix. So you guys can go to pureflix.com and check that out. Fascinating. And so this movie has been seen, it had a theatrical release a bit, didn't it?
It did. It did extremely well in theatrical release, about 50% more viewers than we had ever anticipated.
Wow. Okay, so a lot of people have seen this.
Yes.
I'm guessing you've gotten some feedback because this probably rattled some people who aren't believers. Maybe woke up some sleeping believers and got other people really excited. What kind of feedback have you gotten on the documentary?
Yeah, got incredible feedback. For the believers, the general feedback we get is that it has strengthened their faith. Yeah. It has encouraged them in their faith and give them more confidence in their faith. From the non-believers or people who are kind of spiritual seekers who have viewed it, they've taken this seriously, and many of them have said, I need to read the book because it goes into much more detail and depth, and it's all footnoted and documented. We've had cases of people who've come to faith as a result of it. And I hope more and more of that happens. I hope that people use this documentary as a way to reach out to friends and say, hey, why don't we watch this together? Because honestly, Randy, people are, I think today, more than a lot of times in history, very open to talking about the afterlife. 30% of people know someone who's died during the pandemic. I lost my own brother, who was an atheist, died during the pandemic. And so I think we're more open to this question of what does happen when we die. I want to know. I remember my wife and I were at a restaurant and the waitress burst into tears. And we said, what's wrong? And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. I almost didn't come into work today. We just lost a family member to COVID. And I'm thinking, here's a young woman, probably 18 years old, never thought about death before. Why should she? She's got her whole life ahead of her. But now death has come knocking on her family's door. And now she's got apprehension. Now she's got anxiety about it. And so we were able to minister and share with her. And I think it's just an easy time to get into conversations along these lines.
All right. You know me a little bit. Are you ready to go off track a little bit with some questions? These questions are not in the pre-planned, the suggested questions that the publisher provides. Because you brought something up.
Yeah.
And okay, so there is a well-known minister. I won't mention his name. He passed away several years ago, who sat here with us, and we were talking about some different things as we do around here. And he said, I would never say this publicly, but I suspect that for people who die without Christ, God has something up his sleeve. Now, I know you're familiar with this idea of Christian universalism, when we see scriptures that say Jesus died for the sin of the world, things like every knee will bow and every tongue confess. Some draw the conclusion that you're going to heaven, you just don't know it, kind of thing. And I do not agree with that. So anybody watching out there, I can't read all of Scripture and come to that conclusion. But when you talk about these near-death experiences where someone has died but they come back to the body and they get a glimpse of hell, I kind of go, is there sort of a great divorce kind of thing going on here where God gives us the opportunity at some point where we've left the body and get a glimpse of reality to come to him? And you mentioned, you lost a brother who was an atheist. We don't know what happened between the time that he was not able to respond to you and now. but we know God is really good, and He's gone through a lot of trouble to offer salvation. Do you see anything in there that says maybe God's got something that we don't know about that's just an extra bit of grace and mercy?
Well, here it's a great question. I deal with this in my book. We don't really touch it in the movie. I deal with this in my book. I deal with Christian universalism, the idea that we're all ultimately saved. And like you, I don't buy it. I think it's a heretical position. I think it's false. And I document that in the book through Scripture and show that universalism is not biblical. However, that there is an issue raised by some people, including Martin Luther, which is there the possibility of salvation after death? There's a new book out published by InterVarsity Academic on this question called Postmortem Opportunity. And the question is, would some people who didn't get a chance to hear the gospel in this world, not people who've heard the gospel and rejected it, but people supposedly live on an island somewhere, they don't hear the gospel, or they were mentally disabled during their life and couldn't understand the gospel, or they were given a false gospel, or they were an infant when they died and never understood the gospel. Could it be, and Martin Luther seems to suggest yes, that after death, they would get an opportunity to respond to the gospel? That's a very interesting question. I deal with it in my book through an interview with a Christian philosopher. And there is, as I say, some new book, a respectable book by a respectable Christian publisher that is out on. I haven't read it yet. I've got it. But I think it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer right now.
Yeah.
I think there may be some problems with it, but Martin Luther seemed to lean in that direction, and he was no slouch theologically. So it's an open question, I think it shouldn't dissuade us or discourage us from sharing the gospel to everyone we can.
Yeah, and I think that is the danger. Of course, you would have that book, Lee Strobel, by the way. You have that book, but I think both of us would agree. Why would you wait? Because salvation is not just for the afterlife. It's for now. What is Paul? I think he was writing to Timothy when he said, "Take hold of eternity now, to which you were called now." Something like that. There's an immediacy to hey, let's do this now, and that would be our message, right?
Yeah, absolutely. To respond now while you can, and to live a life of. I remember Evel Knievel, the famous motorcycle daredevil guy who came to faith at the end of his life and had read my book, and we became friends. And his biggest lament was, if I'd only come to faith as a teenager, I could have lived my life differently. And that haunted him. And because he didn't come to faith until a few years before he died. He was in his, I think, late 60s. Yeah. And so, he knew he would go to heaven, which is great, but he missed this life. He missed living a life of following Christ. And so I think you're right. We want to come to faith, not just so we can be assured of eternity in heaven with God, but so we can live a life with God and be salt and light to a world that desperately needs him.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus himself said, "I came that you would have life and life more abundantly." He means now. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah. So I mean, I do really. I mean, why wait? If you're on the bubble, you're watching this, and you're thinking, I'm just curious about this whole thing. I just try it. Just jump in. I mean, hey, if the pool's empty, you're not going to get wet. But if you jump in and it changes everything, you'll see. I want to ask you real quickly before I let you go about some of the people in the documentary itself. Of course, I saw Francis Chan, Miel San Marcos, which not a lot of Americans know, but a fabulous Spanish language worship leader.
He is.
But you also have Luis Palau.
Yes. I interviewed Luis Palau. He knew he was dying. He's the famous evangelist. He shared his faith with 1 billion people during his lifetime. He was a friend of mine and my hero of mine. And he knew he was dying. And I wanted to interview someone, a Christian who knew they were about to go to heaven. And I had a very profound interview with Luis Palau. In the movie, you hear the audio tape, but he died before we were able to get it on video. Wow. But I did have an audio tape, and it was a profound interview. And the one thing he told me, I said to him, "Luis, when you're in heaven for a while, if you could send a text message back to earth, to all the Christians on earth, what do you think it would say?" And he kind of smiled and he said, "I think it would say, go for it. Go for it. Share the message with someone. Take a risk. Get into a spiritual conversation. The Holy Spirit will guide you. He'll convict them of their sin. You just share this good news of Christ. And then I said, well, what do you think if you could send a message back from heaven to those who aren't believers? And he thought for a second. He said, I think I'd say, don't be stupid. In other words, do the right thing. Receive Christ. Why would you not?
Yeah, I love it. And that really, that's what we're saying. If you guys are watching, and again, you have not made that kind of decision. Lee, I know you've got another interview. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Sure.
Is there anything I missed before I let you go? I want to give you the last word.
No, just to say that, the ministry that y'all have with the wells that you drill in countries that need water, that last time I was on the show with Sheila Walsh and the gang, my wife and I built a well. We said, we want to do that. We want to be part of that. And that's a great blessing to our life to know that through the ministry there, that we're blessing people in a very physical way and bringing them a cup of cold water.
And I think that illustrates part of the joy of having Christ now, and not just for the afterlife, because you can make a difference through very practical things and meeting people's needs. And we appreciate you, Lee, and your support, and just bless you and love what you're doing. So thank you again for everything, your friendship, your support, and taking the time to talk about the case for heaven.
I appreciate that. God bless you and your viewers.
Absolutely. And check out the website right here. It's thecaseforheavenmovie.com. And you can go watch it. PureFlix. If you don't have PureFlix, you should just get PureFlix. You get all sorts of great stuff. And come back. We've got more for you right here on Life Today Live. We'll see you again next time.
God incarnate as the appointed mediator between God and man. No man comes to the Father but by me.